here for the first time today, and so I'm going to go ahead and introduce one more time our participants, and then I'm going to start with a couple of questions. We'll see what that does. We'll let them ask their questions of each other, and we'll see where that goes. We'll end then at 4 o'clock. Joanna Brooks is a national voice on religion and American life. She's the author of The Book of Mormon Girl, a memoir of an American faith, a senior correspondent for religiondispatches.org, an award-winning scholar and teacher, and a chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature at San Diego State University. John Moorhead is the custodian for the Evangelical Chapter of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy and director of the Western Institute for Intercultural Studies. He's the co-editor and contributing author for Encountering New Religious Movements, a Holistic Evangelical Approach, and the editor of Beyond the Burning Times, a Pagan and Christian in Dialogue, co-founder and editor of Sacred Tribes Journal. He's been involved for many years in interreligious relationships and conversations in the context of Islam, Mormonism, and paganism. Joshua Stanton is Associate Director of the Center for Global Judaism at Hebrew College and Director of Communications at the Coexist Foundation. He's founding co-editor of the Journal of Interreligious Dialogue, which is helping to bring interreligious studies as an academic field. Joshua likewise co-edits ON Scripture. I'm not sure what ON stands for.
It's ON is on Scripture, so in this case, Odyssey Networks. It's a product.
I get it. The Torah, a weekly online Torah commentary featured in the Huffington Post. Joshua Stanton will be ordained a rabbi in May and received his master's in Hebrew literature in 2012 from Hebrew Union College, where he studies as Schusterman Rabbinical Fellow. Josh serves on the board of directors of Odyssey Networks, World Faith and Education as Transformation, as well as the editorial advisory boards of Cross Currents Magazine and the Interfaith Observer. And Chris Stedman, last but certainly not least, as we know from the presentation he's given already today, is the Assistant Humanist Chaplain at the Harvard University and the Values and Action Coordinator for the Humanist Community at Harvard. He's also the Emeritus Managing Director of State Formation at the Journal of Interreligious Dialogue, founder of the first blog dedicated to exploring atheist interfaith engagement, nonprofit status. He's the author of Faithiest, How an Atheist Found Common Ground with the Religious, has written articles for the Huffington Post, the Washington Post, Religion Dispatches, among other forums. Chris is an atheist working to foster positive and productive dialogue and collaborative action both between faith communities and the non-religious. I'm James Faulconer. I'm a philosophy professor at BYU and happy to be here to help facilitate some of this discussion. I'd like to start, though, by disagreeing somewhat with what Blair said this morning. Blair talked about the necessity of being bilingual in these discussions, and I think, as we've seen today, that 2 languages is never going to be enough. We've got to be multilingual. We've seen it done today in bilingual ways. All right, so we've seen an atheist evangelical conversation and a Mormon Jewish conversation. We didn't see a Mormon atheist and so on and so forth, all the other combinations. And I'm interested in having you respond to how it is that it's possible to be multilingual. I'm a convert to Mormonism. I was a Disciples of Christ, a Protestant denomination. So I got one vocabulary by being born into it. I got another vocabulary by conversion. I've had the opportunity to have friends of other faiths and teachers of other faiths with whom I've had some dialogues and able to pick up some language of other religions. But it isn't easy, even with some of that experience, to be able to have that multilingualism that's necessary for genuine conversation between groups. So my question to start with is, how do we do that?
Well, just to jump in, as I think stereotypically in Jewish culture, many of us might do at the same time. First is we all found common cause at Starbucks today, albeit buying different products. So I think there's some
cold
common
and hot
ground.
caffeine.
I almost wonder, one of the topics that's come up in passing for us a great deal has been the question of leadership. What is leadership within our respective religious communities or non-religious communities? What does it look like, and how are the institutions themselves changing and adapting to the new needs that really our communities have? And so I think that there is a common language emerging across religious traditions, at least insofar as I've been exposed to them, about leadership and about service and for those on the religious side of the spectrum, sacred service, and what that can mean. And so I think that that can be an entry point for a number of individuals, certainly on the clergy or lay leader side or non-religious leadership side of things. And I'm almost wondering if that might be an interesting place for us to all jump in as leaders in one respect or another of our different religious and non-religious traditions.
All right, I'll jump in. I'm not Jewish, but I'll jump in next.
Another stereotype.
Yeah, there you go. Unfortunately, within evangelicalism, there isn't much of an interest, there hasn't been, in bilingualism or anything beyond that for quite some time. And I think the reason is, one of the reasons is because we have been fortunate up until very recently to be a religious majority. And therefore, if you're the majority, there really isn't, the perception has not been that there's the great and pressing need to do that. And even with that changing somewhat, still the tendency is when you take a world religions course or something in seminary or maybe in a Sunday school class, I hate to say it, but I think it's true. It's in order to get to know what's wrong with the other religious groups so you can know why you should avoid them or how you should evangelize them, right? And for me, that's never, I gravitated towards some of that in years past, but I've always been passionate about and excited about and curious about why do people believe and practice the different ways in which they do. And it goes back to what I talked about in my opening presentation. For me, interreligious relationships and conversations are not about a discipline. It's not about something that I have to do now that I'm not in the religious majority. It's something that flows out of an emotion, an attitude, and a way of life. Because I live in a pluralistic world, and I recognize, and I don't know that many Christians do, that probably most people that I run across aren't going to embrace my message if they don't share it already. What then? How do I live in this pluralistic context in ways that are faithful to my own tradition as well as faithful to them as human beings traveling the same planet? So I think for evangelicals, we've got to tap into the best of our own tradition and recognize that there are very good reasons for why we should be bilingual, and it's not just simply so that it's a means to the end of trying to convert the other individual, which many times that's been the motivation for us.
Well, one thing that I think is particularly interesting in this respect is, perhaps less so among sort of explicitly self-identified atheists or agnostics or secular people, but among this really rapidly growing number of young people who are religiously disaffiliating. Today, 1 in 3 Americans under the age of 30 no longer identifies with any kind of religious tradition, and the majority of those folks say that they're not looking for one. They're not looking for a religious community. They don't want to belong to one. And people have sort of theorized about why this rapid disaffiliation is happening, and I've heard some pretty compelling explanations. One is that a lot of young people are seeing religious institutions and organized religion as being aligned with values that aren't consistent with their own, being aligned with the religious right or conservative politics, and in keeping with views that that do not resonate with the more sort of pluralistic way in which they see the world. But regardless of what the sort of reason is that these folks are disaffiliating, as I said, the vast majority of them aren't looking for any kind of religious institution, and to go a step further, they're not looking necessarily for any kind of religious leader. And so I think that this is going to present a really interesting challenge for people in terms of navigating how to be multilingual in the face of religious differences, because there's this really quickly growing constituency that sort of actively rejects the idea of a label, but still maintains a lot of the same beliefs that exist within religious communities. Only 16% of millennials who identify as religiously unaffiliated identifies atheists, and only 17% of those religiously unaffiliated folks identify as agnostics. And even among those folks, 36% claim to believe in God or a universal spirit, which, if you can explain that to me, that would be really helpful. So I think that this is a group of people that's growing really quickly, that we don't know that much about, that we really need to do more extensive research on in order to figure out where they fit into these interfaith or inter-worldview conversations when they don't necessarily claim a particular identity. And as a humanist chaplain at Harvard, who basically, I work with atheists, agnostics, humanists, and the non-religious. In many ways, myself and the other humanist chaplain are sort of seen as the kind of catch-all resources for students who don't affiliate with a particular religious tradition. And my challenge is learning how to meet the needs of people who, are in this sort of, non-religious, but still kind of, spiritual or religious space. And I think that and when we think about sort of being multiliterate, or multilingual and multiliterate in these conversations, we need to now recognize that that means that there's this really large group of people that reject the idea of sort of subscribing to a single worldview or language at all, and they're going to bring really individualized frameworks into the conversation, and figuring out where these folks fit in is, I think, going to be a really unique challenge.
Well, and your comment, I think, flags for me, people who study secularism, and secularization, which is something that was supposed to have happened to us in the 20th century, which we all know is just a story we tell ourselves about the 20th century. The language of the public square and of secularism used to be a kind of highbrow Protestantism erased of Jesus, right? And with the rise of the nuns, this generation, Chris, you work with especially, that's changing. And, the younger ones, they speak secularism and interfaith too, but I think if you had to say what it sounded like, and John, this is the culture shift that evangelical Christians are experiencing, as, the lingua franca is no longer Protestantism. And I think it sounds like Jewish humor with a dash of Buddhism, with a dash of, yoga-inspired Hindu, with, really,
oh yeah,
it's shifting.
Totally piecemeal.
But there is a pidgin, right? It's a pidgin, and a pidgin language, not with a G-E-O-N, but a DG, like they speak in the islands or in trade communities, right? So, but this, I think for me, this asks us to back up and think about Jim's larger question about multilingualism. Is this sort of just a convenient term we've adopted? Like, as a scholar of my roots are in studying language and literature. So, is religion really a language that one speaks? Is that a sufficient? Is that a well-developed, is that a thoughtful enough category to describe what this thing is that we're doing? And with multilingualism, because, even when you're multilingual, you may dream in one language. Like, is there still a sense of home? Is there a way in which, because I like the idea of being bilingual, but I wonder if there's some limits on the concept we need to test as we try and work out the conversation. I mean, what does it mean to describe religion as a language? What does a language do? Does a language constitute a reality? Does a language refer to a reality? What does language do? You know how to answer. We could have a discussion about it.
I'm just a moderator.
No. But when we say to this whole group, when we say, okay, religion's a language, and you grew up, your first language is Mormon. And then something happened, and you acquired a second language, and that language is, Hinduism, and now you're sort of multilingual. Is that, microphone always, is that, what does that entail? What kinds of obligations? Does that seem like a fair way? Is Mormonism just a language? When we say that, do we mean both Mormonism and Hinduism refer to a real reality where there is truth, but they just have different ways of describing that truth? Or is it more complicated than that?
It's more complicated than that.
That's all. Can you say something?
Josh looks like he has something he wants to say.
Oh, putting me on the spot.
Well, I saw you inch in towards the mic, and then I cut you off with my sassy humor. Sorry.
Well, I think it's an interesting question. Is this a linguistics problem such that we can look at it in terms of convergence, divergence, separation in that kind of way? I'm not sure it is. I think it's much more of a narrative issue in some ways. First of all, we're speaking in the first person in a way and to an extent that we probably never have before. It's all about telling your story online. It's much more exciting and meaningful if I take a picture of a cat and say, I saw this cat and it made me smile, than telling an abstract story that could be about something that is conceivably more globally significant than a particular cat that I saw. A lot of it is anchoring experiences and our understandings of reality within our own narratives. My impression, at least of my own religious tradition, which is polythetic, which has many different strains, is that there are particular narratives we can use to construct from Judaism, to a certain extent piecemeal, but a lot of them come prefab in a certain way, that we can use to have a meta-narrative with which we intertwine our own. Being part of the Jewish people means weaving your own story in relation to that of your ancestors for a number of thousands of years, in my opinion. And so I'm wondering if we talk about this in terms of narrative theory as opposed to language, which even deconstructs narrative theory to the point that it's hard for me to work with in this way.
But if you're in a slightly maybe a younger religious tradition, and one where you're a more orthodox point on the spectrum, it takes a lot of Mormons a long, long time before they can even say that they have a story separate from the official story. And a lot of us don't ever feel comfortable feeling that. I mean, I think maybe our grandparents did because they had a differently inhabited sense of the tradition, but especially for those of us in post-correlation, post-1950s Mormonism, people feel guilty if their version of Mormonism doesn't line right up. And so there's a sense in which the narrative precedes any of us as individuals. It could be just that we're younger, though, because I've never heard any Mormon say, I say it because I'm goofy and unorthodox, but I've never heard, you won't hear someone in a regular church saying, regular Sunday saying, we'll bear testimonies, but your story must conform to the narrative expectations of the people.
But aren't there different experiences one can have even within an orthodox set of norms about the fora and the particular means of going about it? To take a concrete example, I'm having the real pleasure of hearing the Mormon Tabernacle Choir on Sunday. And there are going to be a lot of people there, and I think each one is going to have a different experience and construct a different story about the same event, which to a certain extent, is normative. I would imagine the same is prayer. Larry Hoffman describes it as sacred drama. And there is narrative theory related to drama. You look at Aristotle's Poetics, you look at other elements there, but different people look at the same drama and derive different lessons. And I wonder if for the first time, people are able to articulate, I came away from this prayer experience and my heart was heavy because it reminded me of X, because I tied it together with the following experience. And if all of a sudden we're starting to get reactions from the same, even if orthodox moments, that tie into narrative in a different way.
Yeah, I think that religion as narrative is a particularly useful lens for looking at this, especially in light of sort of the narrative exchange that goes on in a moment of sort of interfaith encounter. I remember when I was in the third grade, I moved to a new city, and the other person who lived in the neighborhood who was my age, who lived just up the street, was a child of an interfaith marriage. Her father was Catholic and she was Jewish, but she was much more involved in sort of like what you were talking about earlier today. She was much more involved in her mother's Judaism and in the Jewish community. And up until that point in my life, as I mentioned in my remarks, religion really wasn't a significant part of my life in any way, and so I was really intrigued by this. And the thing that intrigued me the most is that she was, of course, in third grade, I probably wouldn't have framed it in quite this way, but she was part of a larger narrative that she could trace back thousands and thousands of years. And I looked at my own life and I was like, what is my narrative? Where can I place myself within history? I'm kind of just floating off in space over here. And so, because I was young, I was like, well, maybe I should adopt this narrative. And so I got myself a Teach Yourself Hebrew book for children. And I went to a Seder with her family. And I remember, even though it was third grade, and I don't remember much from third grade, but I remember going home after that Seder and saying to my mom, that was a really interesting story, but I don't think it's my story. And even at that age, I knew that the narrative that I was being formed in was different than that narrative. And even though there were some striking parallels and that I drew inspiration from the story that I heard at the Seder, it wasn't mine. And when I became an evangelical, one of the things that I think created so much sort of personal strife and grief for me was that there were a set of prescribed narratives that I could plug into, and none of them led to the place that I wanted to go. As a queer person, there wasn't a narrative that was made available to me, an evangelical narrative, that fit the way that I saw myself. And I think that one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this idea of interfaith dialogue is because by allowing these narratives to intermingle and interact with one another, the narratives change by interacting with other narratives, and people realize that there are more options for them, that the narrative that they have come into by whatever sort of circumstance, whether it's through birth or through conversion or whatever, isn't necessarily the narrative that they have to adopt. And even though when I was young, I knew that the Jewish narrative, though it was quite beautiful, wasn't mine. As I got older and became more exposed to different ideas and perspectives, I was able to see that I could sort of plug into a certain narrative and yet also be in relationship with these other narratives and have them be things that inform my life, even though they're not mine, if that makes sense. So it's a sense that it's not a narrative that you own, but it's something that you participate with rather than participate in.
I'll add my 2 cents. I like the idea of bilingual in terms of a metaphor, just trying to get people to see you need to not only understand your own religious tradition or irreligious one, but those of others amongst whom you live. But if we move beyond that to try and grapple with a way to better understand what we're talking about, I like the idea of narrative. I think it's very helpful. In fact, I've offered the critique of evangelicals. We tend to understand other religious traditions by way of beliefs and doctrine because that's our orientation, and we always tend to look at others through the lens by which we understand ourselves. And you end up with this reified misunderstanding many times. So things like ritual, like ethics, I think are more central to Mormonism, sacred story and mythology. However, I would just urge that in this context, we need to keep in mind that narrative is not just floating out there as a belief and a series of propositions. It's rooted in a sociocultural context. And you can't just, I think one of the errors is, at least for evangelicals, is the thinking if I give you a formulaic gospel message, I can extract you from your narrative and your culture and plop you into evangelicalism, and you're just supposed to gravitate and plug and play kind of a thing. Plug your iPod into this new playlist, and then you go from Mormonism or atheism to evangelicalism. And I think that ignores the depth at which our cultural and subcultural and narrative contexts inhabit the core of who we are. And so I think we have to look at it from the cultural angle as well. So I think it's more of a multicultural kind of perspective.
I'm going to ask you if I can do something I've never heard done before, and I think
Okay.
you can do it.
All right.
Because I'm working with this idea of narrative, and I know what it sounds like to tell the peoplehood narrative of Judaism, and we tell it every year at Passover at the Seder, right? And one of them is a part of the story, and I know what it's like to tell a peoplehood narrative of Mormonism, that starts the restoration, involves crossing the plains, right?
Right.
That locates us in a historical and cultural context. If you were to tell a narrative about American evangelicalism that located it as a movement among movements in historical and specific cultural context, what would that sound like? Because one of the things that strikes me about evangelicalism is that the truth claims are fundamental, right? Because American evangelicalism arose early 20th century as a reaction to higher criticism in some ways, and has been about de-specifying, decontextualizing, and sort of reasserting universal fundamental truth value of Christ's sovereignty and in the salvation of humankind. So if you were to retell the story of American evangelicalism as a specific narrative, what would that sound like?
See, I don't think
Do you have a
evangelicals...
peoplehood story?
I don't think they have a peoplehood story, see, and that's
That
the
would be
difference.
helpful.
Right,
That would be
yeah.
helpful, because then we could talk like equals.
Right. I don't think that we do. I think, again, it's more on the propositional, the doctrinal, that kind of, the
Right.
creedal, that kind of a thing. So we're talking on one level, and the people that we're trying to interact with are coming at it from a very different perspective, and we end up missing each other. I do think that evangelicals are rediscovering their own sacred narrative in terms of looking at the overarching biblical story from creation, fall, redemption, those kinds of things. They're rediscovering that in certain contexts, but that's a very different thing. There is no, as far as I understand it, there's no personal story of American evangelicalism other than we differentiated ourselves and broke away from fundamentalism because we wanted to engage culture and these types of things, but there's no sense of story as you find in Mormonism, Judaism.
That would be an interesting,
Yeah.
that would be really interesting to hear.
There's another way to deal with the same question, though, because I mean, language is one analogy we can use. We can use the narrative as another analogy. Since I teach Heidegger, obviously I'm going to think Heidegger has a better analogy yet. And it seems to me that his talk about religion as a way of being in the world, and I think in that case atheism fits as well. It's not just a story, though it may very well involve a story, but it doesn't have to. But there is this, there's just some way in which everything fits together, often unconsciously, often in an inherited way, as well as what's done explicitly, most frequently as a part of some larger community in which, you know, there are these disagreements even within the community about what counts and what doesn't. Nevertheless, within that larger way of being in the world, there's some commonality about this is how we are. This is how we are in the world. And that may be a way of talking about it.
And not only how we are, but who we are, I think. You know, I think one of the things that often is overlooked or just avoided in interfaith, in certain interfaith conversations, particularly I think in higher education contexts, is that you know, religion is, and this is something that I'm particularly sensitive to and aware of as someone who's really actively involved in atheist circles. Religion is so often viewed through the lens of sort of belief and tradition, and less through the lens of sort of personal identity and personal narrative. And you know, I think one of the roadblocks to really sort of constructive conversation between atheists and people of faith is that many on the atheist side see religion as simply about belief and practice, and not about a sort of, sorry?
Belonging.
Yeah, not about belonging, not about identification, or even just a sort of larger cosmology. And I think that, you know, as you posed this question to John, I was sort of thinking like, I couldn't help myself as much as I try to be an active listener. I was thinking to myself, what is the story, what is the narrative of American atheism?
Right.
And you know, there's a narrative of sort of of humanist philosophy. You can trace it back to Renaissance humanism and Epicurus and on and on. And you know, my colleague, the other humanist chaplain at Harvard, Greg Epstein, does a good job of that in his book, Good Without God. But there's still this sense of it's like this is recorded history, but this is not a sort of a narrative. There's, you know, I couldn't tell you what the narrative is of sort of contemporary American atheism, and I think it's because a lot of it is structured in contrast to religious claims at the moment. And this sort of goes back to where I started this comment. It's because American atheism, in at least its sort of really public expressions, is something that is structured in response to and in reaction to particularly religious extremism. There is no overarching narrative of what it means to be an American atheist today. And I think that this is one thing that that interfaith contexts could really offer the atheist community, is creating an opportunity for atheists to begin writing that story through the process of being in conversation with other communities.
Less about sort of an atomizing individualism that gives us sort of a nun's pigeon that does always with the microphone, and it could be about the. It doesn't have to be so individualistic, and then it's also a good basis for actual dialogue. Mm-hmm. This is who we are. This is what we have to contribute to the conversation, rather than this is how we are not like you categorically.
Sure.
Josh.
Well, I'm also kind of wondering, in terms of contemporary humanism and atheism in the U.S., what the boundaries are. Are there limitations where you can say to somebody, you are no longer a humanist? What does it mean to no longer belong in that community? I think that rabbinic Judaism, to a large extent, is about trying to look for those boundaries. And you see rabbis testing for the liminal case. All right, if we push this concept one step further, is that still okay? Maybe one step further, what about now? Until you go over the line, and then it says, okay, now we can roughly discern where a line might exist. Mm. And I'm wondering, in terms of belonging, rather than having it be a sort of negative alliance of we're not religious, and therefore we're all in a category, as it shifts, and I believe it is shifting to a more positive alliance, we do stand for certain things. Where do you see the boundaries forming?
Well, I think because it's still so, you know, that the sort of formation of a of a larger atheist humanist community of the United States is still very much in its infancy, even though, I mean, the American Atheists has been around for a long time as an organization. I mean, a lot of the infrastructure has been there for a little while now, but in terms of it really having this sort of ethos of a community, it's still a pretty new thing. And so I don't think, there is a real sense of where the boundaries are. And I think when oftentimes young movements tend to draw the boundaries, draw the lines of the boundaries with a particularly thick black marker. And they, I think tend to sort of make them very small. The number of people who are included in this group is pretty small, and people who are who seem to deviate from the stated goals of whatever the movement is are seen as, if not traitors, at least as outsiders. And so I think that as this movement begins to sort of grow and expand and include more and more diverse voices, those boundaries are going to continue to be pushed out further and further. I mean, on the one hand, I have certainly with the some of the conversations I've been trying to work around in atheist circles, I've been sort of cast outside of the circle of belonging by some folks, but I've actually been really heartened and encouraged by the fact that the number of people who have sort of deemed me as not a true atheist with a capital T and a capital A were fewer than I thought they would be. And to me, it suggests that that process of boundary expansion is already well underway. And even if it's not entirely apparent right now where those boundaries are, they're beginning to develop and they're sort of beginning to expand. So I don't have an answer for you yet, but I really suspect that in 10 years' time that there's going to be a much clearer picture of that.
Well, Joanna, when we were talking briefly just before we started, you said you have a couple of questions. So I'm going to briefly let Joanna take my place here.
Oh, goodness.
You can ask some questions.
No one can take your place. I was just thinking, and especially since, we've already chewed up a good portion of this hour talking amongst ourselves, and given that, our hosts and the hosts at the UVU Institute of Religion and the strongly LDS identification of this campus, I wonder how, I'd just love to hear the audience talk a little bit, especially those of you who have sat here all day. How does it, or how has it impacted your own relationship to your own faith to, participate in interfaith conversation, especially on difficult topics? Not just like kumbaya, we all agree on things, we all want to be nice, but, that's good. But, to have conversations that touch on irreconcilable differences and points of persistent non-agreement, how does that, and how have today's proceedings impacted your own view of your faith? Before
you start, let me do two things. One is to remind you, we want you to have a microphone in front of you when you speak, and that goes to Joanna again, too. The other is just to underline something that she said, and that is, and this has come out also in John's things that he said, it's one of the really important things about these kinds of discussions is an honest acknowledgement of differences. In fact, Joshua brought it up earlier. There may be, in the very beginning, there may very well be differences that are irreconcilable, and it's important for us to know when those occur and to be able to talk about why they are and what's going on with them. So, yeah, I think we really do want to avoid at all costs kumbaya. We can sing it later in the evening if you'd like, but for now, let's not. So those of you who have questions, we have microphones for you.
And the hands go up. Yay!
You guys hear me? This is such a great thing. I'm in a class of Thinking, Knowing, Being, learning about Heidegger and also David Bohm. And we talk about boundaries a lot in fragmentation and dialogue, and how he says it's really important for this dialogue to happen, and fragmentation to kind of be exposed as a, what's the word? It's an illusion. So the boundaries, I just have a comment on boundaries that if you could say like the doctrine is very, very, sort of a concrete thing that you believe in. That is the boundary. And that exists like within your mind, within yourself, and among people who share that doctrine. You can say there's the doctrine that that doctrine is interesting to look at and to respect, and that's part of bridging the gap. But I would say that the dialogue is in a boundaryless realm, that there are no boundaries in the dialogue. And what's taking place is very significant, and you are writing the history of American atheism right now. I want to, just commend you for that. And this is really important. Baum says for insight together we need dialogue. And individually a person can have insight, but we need it together because now the civilization has reached a stage where it cannot proceed in any other way. I believe that we are really to that stage, and so the doctrine, I just want to say again, is important to look at and to respect, but I was going to say language. There is a language within religion. I was going to say dialect, kind of, but like we use words and symbols, within each language. There are symbols that represent some things, and I would propose that like there are some symbols that represent the very same kind of feeling, for each of you. And I'm LDS, and part of like being able to have this dialogue with atheism is to understand what are the symbols that you have in your life that help you to like create your identity as an atheist that are meaningful for you, because I believe that the hope and the love, like Baum says here, says what is universal between us in this boundaryless realm where the dialogue takes place is hope and love, for greater things. And so I have a question, I guess, is what are some symbols, or, we have Christ and Moses, I guess, and I'm sorry, I don't know, but I know that, Buddha or Krishna, there are some leaders, like you were saying earlier, some leaders in our, each of our religions or communities, or what are some leaders that you look to that have helped you to feel more concrete in your system of beliefs and your doctrine, so to speak, and what are some symbols that I could identify with, and so I could help to bridge that gap through this dialogue. And the power of language is there is a power in it, and so
Thank you.
that's all I have to say.
It's a great question. I think that there are certainly thinkers and writers and creators who have been really influential on my thinking and my personal development. Some of them are sort of categorically religious. I have 2 degrees in the study of religion. I come from a religious background. Clearly, I have drawn some inspiration and gleaned some learning from religious figures and individuals. But I would say that as a humanist, one of the most formative sort of writers and thinkers for me has been Carl Sagan. And there's actually the other quote at the opening of the book is from Carl Sagan, and I actually have that quote tattooed on my arm, and it says, "For small creatures such as we, the vastness is bearable only through love." That is from the book Contact. And Carl Sagan is someone that I look to as a real humanist, as somebody who was really able to marry a love for sort of learning and education and critical thinking with a real sense of awe and wonder and compassion for humanity, and a real love for not only human potential but also humanity and its failings. And so he's somebody that I would point to as an influential sort of leader, I suppose, though I don't know if he would ever have seen himself in that way. And in terms of symbols, I think that this is one of the things that I find equal parts sort of exciting and also like really daunting and frustrating and challenging about being an atheist and a humanist, is that a lot of that sort of symbolic, a lot of the symbols really just aren't there. And this is like, I mentioned earlier in my remarks that I had a conversation with a professor who was sort of making the argument for the symbolic weight of God. And I found myself sort of unable to use this idea of God in a world where God is a really sort of real and meaningful concept for a lot of people, to use it as a purely sort of symbolic thing, which means that in sort of giving that up, I sort of enter into a realm in which there's a kind of vacuum for symbols, and yet, I think that the development of these symbols are sort of, it's ongoing. And for me, one sort of quasi-symbol I would point to, I guess, is this idea of human potential, that in spite of our, in many ways, wretched history as a species, we contain within ourselves the capacity to be greater, to achieve new things, to realize new ideas, and think in new and innovative ways about how to respond to the challenges that we face as human beings. And maybe you wouldn't call that a symbol, but I guess that's sort of one thought that comes to mind.
I'm actually, is it okay if I just
Please.
follow up briefly? I think one of the interesting elements that's come up a couple of times in passing is the idea of the shared symbol. So I think with Judaism and atheism, a couple that come to mind, first is Spinoza, who I do consider a Jew, and probably a modern Reform Jew, if there were such a thing, in the Netherlands when he was learning and being evicted from his community. Mm-hmm. And I think of Einstein also as someone who was very much in the realm of Spinoza, but also deeply Jewishly connected in many different ways. I think of the idea—
We have a lot of overlap. Humanism and Judaism, there's a lot of overlap there.
And I'm thinking similarly, you mentioned Moses, and I imagine he's very significant for evangelicals and Mormons as well, although we have very different conceptions. And so I wonder about the question if there is an implicit tug that may come to the fore as our narratives develop and as they come into conversation more, in terms of saying, what is this symbol, and and what tradition is this person, idea, moment a symbol of? Like when we think of Mount Sinai as a prophetic moment, I would bet you that the three people who consider it a very significant prophetic moment around the table think of it in different ways, much like Chris, you and I probably think of Spinoza and say, he's mine, he's one of my guys.
I'm happy to share.
You share, okay, good. That was showing the true humanist spirit of
I'm having one of those days where I'm able to live out my highest principles to a certain degree.
We have several hands up here.
Something that struck me when you asked your question is, I keep thinking, I know very little about other religions. I was raised LDS and still am. But what I love that I think encompasses the whole theme of this conference is what C.S. Lewis said, that we're all members of the same household. We choose different doors. But while we're with each other, we need to show respect, regardless of which door we choose. So I applaud you guys for, giving me different understanding of your religions.
Well, my question is, what's that a door to? Because I'm not sure we would agree that we're all in line trying to find, different doors to the same goal or whatever. I'm not sure necessarily. I think one of the painful things that might be worth discussing is mutually irreconcilable beliefs, even about end goal. Is it self-actualization? Is it identification with a particular notion of God? What is the goal here?
Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Lisa Torriente, mother of 5, back in school after breaking my back. I'm actually a nurse professionally, or was. I wanted to go back to your question, Joanna, if that's okay. I talked to you a little bit briefly in private, which was really inspirational, by the way. I based on the examples of these 4 fine individuals, don't you think, at least in my opinion, I could be a member of any of these 4 communities based on their example and be very happy and live a very fulfilling life. So I appreciate the examples that you guys have brought here today. It's very inspiring for me. You guys talked about lines and categories and boundaries, and I just felt that maybe if we learned to follow the examples of these 4 awesome examples to me, if we erase the lines and erase the categories and not need to be categorized. I think in the U.S. especially, we feel like we have to categorize ourselves into, we have to be into this group, and it makes us more individual, yet we can have this connection. I think that if we learn to erase those lines and those categories, I think that there can be less of a division and more love. That's one thing I've learned today. I found it very interesting when baptisms of the dead were brought up. The importance of baptisms for the dead for the LDS culture, but more importantly, what is in a name. That was so interesting to me. Another thing I learned was both Chris and Joanna took a step back from what they grew up in, and that's actually what I'm doing now on a personal level for me. And for Chris, he decided that the way he was raised and from the time he was 11, right? He kind of stepped back from that and decided that wasn't his path. And Joanna stepped back a little bit from what she had and decided that she wanted to go back to that path. And for me, it's been inspirational because I'm at that point where I can choose and I can decide what path I want to be on. And for me, that's very inspiring as well. I just think that we should love the similarities and love the differences among all religions and non-religions. And if we truly erase those boundaries and love one another, whether we believe it because we learned it in the Bible, or if we believe it because, obviously, as Chris has those compassionate and kind beliefs, that we truly can be a better place and a better world, better people.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I wanted to go off that too. You were mentioning how this discussion here impacted our belief in our church. I think it doesn't change much. It helps me realize that the goal of religion is to get you closer to God, and the idea of getting closer to God is so you can learn how to have these relationships with other people in the world. That's, to me, that's what religion is. And if you're using religion to get closer to God, to kind of separate yourself from everybody else in the world, then you're not using religion right. You don't understand it. Religion is supposed to be unifying. It's not just one denomination and you stick together and that's what it is. You're supposed to be embracing other people regardless of what their beliefs are. And to go back to the joke Blair brought up is when you bring a Jew, a Mormon, an atheist, and an evangelical and you put them in a bar, they should be getting along. They should be getting past their differences. And that's what should be happening here. It shouldn't matter. Like, we could be talking about redemption of the dead, and it might be bad for the Jew. The Jew might think it kind of sacrilegious in a way, but he could probably get around that and accept and be like, okay, well, as long as you're doing what's good in your mind sight to my kind, that's good enough for me. And I'll try and do the same for you, because I know in your best interest, you're just trying to share a bit of your love, a bit of your heart with me, because that's what you've been taught. That's what all of us hopefully have been trying to be taught, that we're supposed to get outside ourselves and care about each other. We're not supposed to just worry about ourselves and do whatever we can to make sure we have the most fun in this life, whether we live or don't exist in the next life. We should just be taking the time now to be accepting. And so I think that's the door she was mentioning, that's the door we're looking for. It's just global acceptance, where you can walk into this bar and depending if a person has a religion or doesn't have a religion, you can have a conversation, whether it gets kind of heated or not, but you can still leave each other understanding one another and have an appreciation.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a moderator's privilege here and interrupt to ask that we let's begin with Joshua and work our ways around, but I'd like each of you to take a couple of minutes and give us a kind of summative closing statement, if you don't mind.
So I think that Mormon-Jewish dialogue is in a really new and interesting place just because it hasn't existed in the mainstream in a big way. And so I'm very excited for next steps in terms of it. I feel as though there has been already Jewish evangelical dialogue, Jewish humanist dialogue, especially since a lot of Jews are humanists and a lot of humanists are Jews. But I think that really an area of untapped potential is in Mormon-Jewish dialogue. And so I'm very excited for next steps. I'm very excited to engage with the painful and difficult and sticky issues that far too often we have avoided, and that I think we can no longer afford to avoid.
Go ahead. Thank you.
And just again, I want to reiterate, I know I've been very thankful today, but I just want to reiterate my thanks, Jim, for hosting this, and to UVU and to the Institute. And I know BYU had a hand in this as well, so didn't they?
A little bit.
Yep. So thank you to all the event sponsors. This is I feel very lucky to have been here today and participated with all of you, and I'm thankful for all of your time. And I think the things I walk away with, something I knew coming in was that difficulty has value. You know, hard discussions have value, hard thoughts have value, and that we need not shy away from those, that they can be great proving grounds for our faith rather than places to shy away from to protect a faith. So that's an important note for me. But I also sort of want to end with a reflection that that boundaries have value as well. You know, that, you know, one of the outcomes, you were thinking that, weren't you? Yeah. Oh, good. You know, that one of the ways we can leave a conversation like this is these beautiful, we'd call them testimonies where I come from. You know, that there is so much we share in common, of course, but that there are also things we don't share in common, and that's what gives each of our traditions their particularity, and that's so important, and that only through particularity, I think, is the full grandeur of humanity or God. Choose your term, fully expressed. And that I welcome, you know, I think one of the great frontiers that we kind of happened onto in this last session is the need for particularity in the way each of us presents our faith to the rest of the world. And this is something that minority religions may understand, and we may do it better or worse. When Mormons are in proselytizing frame, we're as universalistic as, you know, and categorical as anyone else. But if we're able to tell our stories to the world as particular stories, and that's something that I don't think we've heard from evangelicals and atheists yet, that fosters a different kind of dialogue, and one that I look forward to unfolding. So.
Well, I would also just like to express my sincere gratitude, not only to the organizers, but to those of you who have come to these events today, whether you've been here for the entire marathon or you just came in here near the end. Thank you for coming and for listening to us and for sharing some of your thoughts. You know, one sort of thing that I'm thinking of as this conversation winds to its conclusion, or rather its sort of break, because these kinds of conversations don't really ever conclude, is that, you know, centrally, you know, I really do sort of celebrate these differences, and I love this language of sort of celebrating our differences. I think this is a really sort of core millennial value. This is something that this sort of younger generation really sees as centrally a part of what it means to be a millennial, what it means to be an American, what it means to be a person of faith, if you're a person of faith, or what it means to be an atheist. And yet, you know, while I am all about celebrating differences and see the real value there, I think that it's worth, and in fact vital, that we have a conversation about which differences are worth celebrating and which perhaps are not. I'm very happy to celebrate, you know, a lot of the things about your evangelical Christian identity and beliefs and narrative that enrich your life and through our relationship enrich mine. But what do I celebrate in an evangelical Christian who holds the belief that I, as a queer person, shouldn't be able to live my life the way that I want to? Do I celebrate that? Where can we find some understanding when there is this real irreconcilable difference? And I think that the tendency is to shy away from those conversations because they're hard, because they make celebrating differences harder. And yet, I think that through those conversations, we can perhaps even find a way to forge through with a new, larger meta-narrative that's going to include many of those differences, but may require that people on all sides shed a few of those differences. I wouldn't advocate that people must shed some differences or a large amount of differences in order to participate in an interfaith conversation. But I think it's worth thinking about as we walk away from this. and this goes back to our conversation about compromise, you know, where it is that we're able to celebrate the differences in others and where that's particularly challenging, and what that means for our ability to have these multilingual conversations.
I want to echo the thanks of my fellow panelists. Thanks to the organizers. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for the dialogue, and thanks to all of you who have come and observed. I don't know that it can be said that evangelical atheist dialogue has begun. Maybe when they write the history books, maybe we started it. Who knows?
I don't think so.
Don't think so? Well, we can hope. I would like to see evangelicals and atheists move beyond. We do a lot of debates. You can see those all over the internet.
Oh, yeah.
But I'd like to see us move beyond that, still recognizing that we disagree with each other in serious ways, but how can we move beyond that in more civil ways to work together for the common good? Mm-hmm. And if our conversation helped contribute to that and maybe opened up a few minds on both sides of that equation, then today is a good day. Beyond that, I appreciate the testimonies we had at the end there, but I think I would offer a slight disagreement in that we are all here as a Jew, a Mormon, an atheist, and an evangelical because we have very different, strongly held opinions, and we think we have good reasons for it. We may be wrong, and that's fine, but there are reasons why. So the idea that we're just grabbing different doors and going into the same room, I think has some intellectual problems with that and so on. Nevertheless, what we, I think, are articulating in an agreement is we can recognize these very real disagreements, and yet we don't have to demonize each other. And we can engage each other, view each other as human beings. We can discuss where compromise might be possible and where we reach those core convictions and we just can't. But even so, we still recognize that we need to work together as human beings in spite of our differences, drawing upon this process of religious diplomacy so that we can make our own communities and the world that we share together a better place. So my challenge to you is not just coming to a conference and watching people do it, but hopefully we model it for you so now you get involved. You keep getting involved in this university, you plug into a chapter on interfaith, whatever it is, you find your way of adopting this idea of interfaith as an emotion and an attitude and a way of life so that you can become multilingual or multicultural and broaden yourself and the community that you live in through what we hopefully have modeled for you today.
Thank you. I think we all are grateful for the organizers and presenters, to Utah Valley University, to the Orem LDS Institute, for those who funded the Richard L. Evans Chair for Religious Understanding, and also for the Foundation for Religious Development, the Evangelical Chapter, for their sponsorship. I'm especially grateful to Kufri I can never say your last name, Kufri Ekpenyong. However, I'm grateful to you, Kufri, for this was Kufri's idea. He's the one who's been pushing it on us for some time, and it was really the powerhouse behind getting this organized. And so we're grateful for those people. I'd like to give them some thanks with their applause.